Good day, I'm Illana Melzer. I work for 71.4 Consulting, an analytics-driven strategy consultancy based in Cape Town, South Africa. Our company has done a lot of analysis on housing data across Africa. In particular, we have worked on data that tracks housing consumers and housing demand. In this module, we've already looked at the supply side of the housing market. But what kind of data is best used to analyze what people are willing and able to pay? In other words, effective demand in a housing market. In this presentation, we will look at various sources of data on housing need and demand and consider the purpose for which each type of data on housing demand can be used. This presentation will also describe how the data universe is expanding and becoming more complex, and how the capacity to analyze the data is growing at the same time. Before we look at data sources, it is important to think about why we collect demand data and about what it says about the market. A major issue with data collection around housing demand is that we are characterizing what currently exists, not what people want, or perhaps even more important, what the city needs. All planners know there is a limit to the extent to which housing is, in fact, demand-led. In addition, our analysis takes as its starting point the household unit, which we assume is exogenous and optimized, when in fact it is often shaped by housing availability. We must take into account that demand is not fixed. Each person optimizes his or her decisions on the basis of available options, incentives, and perceptions. If you come in as a provider and you change the alternatives available to people and try and shape their incentives and perceptions, including of how important they perceive housing and housing investment to be, you might get a different outcome. This matters when we think about housing demand and housing finance. In many African countries, formal, developer-built, mortgage-financed housing is new for many customers. It might not be helpful to ask them if they want to live in a developer-built apartment in a multi-story building, financed with a mortgage. What you've got to use the research to do is to figure out how to shape demand so that housing investment becomes a priority. How to shape an understanding of the investment value and not only the shelter value of housing. You might also need the research to figure out how to build a level of comfort with apartment living and with mortgage finance, which is very unfamiliar. Having said that, let's look at the key data sources for segmenting the demand side of the housing market. This chart summarizes the various demand-side data sources we typically access. It has two dimensions. The effort to collect the data is reflected on the vertical axis, and then the effort to process the data is reflected on the horizontal axis. As we move away from the origin, more activities are automated, and more data can be collected and processed at lower cost. I'm going to start with survey data, because it is the most familiar and most commonly used source of data. It's moderately difficult to collect and not terribly difficult to analyze. It's getting easier to collect this data. Previously, it was all paper-based, so an enumerator would ask people questions and capture the responses on paper. That information would be captured in a spreadsheet and then analyzed. Today, surveys typically use computer-aided personal interviews or CAPI-based data collection. We're also seeing SMS and WhatsApp-based survey platforms that can administer shorter, simpler questionnaires. There are challenges with survey data around sample design and around how people understand the questions. In some cases, interviewees make things up or refuse to answer. In addition, conducting a large sample, face-to-face representative survey is going to be very expensive. The good news is there's a lot of secondary data out there that already exists and that can be analyzed. You don't have to pay to collect the data. Secondary data available from statistical bureaus, which conduct household and demographic surveys, is often very useful in the housing domain. For example, it would be fairly standard in most household surveys to find questions on housing tenure and on building materials used to construct the dwelling. One example of work using survey data is the work that we did with CAF for Access to Finance Rwanda, using both FinScope and the EICV, an income and expenditure survey that's conducted by the National Statistical Institute of Rwanda. We've used the data to characterize subsegments of the market. This data provides details on the type of materials for the roof, walls, and floor, and on access to electricity, water, and sanitation. We can also see household size and composition, as well as employment, age, and marital status. Data on occupation and sources of income for household members gives a good sense of potential bankability of households. Typically, there's a lot of data published in the reports that accompany a survey, but it is important to analyze the raw data. Often these raw data sets are available from the National Statistical Bureau, and you can interrogate them to develop a rich characterization of the markets that you're interested in. The problem with survey data is that you get a snapshot based on a simple question. It helps you see what people are doing, but you're not going to understand why. What is their motivation? What was their experience? For richer analysis, qualitative data, which we have placed on the bottom left of the chart, is really useful. This requires a lot of interfacing between people. An example is an in-depth interview with a landlord. You might ask how she started her business, who is in her target market, how she develops her rental units, and so on. Aside from creating an understanding of motivations and perceptions, the qualitative information you collect helps put a face and a story to the numbers. That matters, where you hope to create a sense of empathy between people in your organization and the market you're trying to serve. Qualitative research also helps hone in on key questions you might want to ask in a survey. In some cases, you can do in-depth interviews yourself by going out and having some conversations with people. You can also collect qualitative data using focus groups. Often you would bring in a professionally trained moderator to conduct the focus group discussion. But it is important to pay attention to the design of the discussion guide. In addition, I would recommend that you attend the discussions with your team. The challenge with getting a researcher to do this for you is that they're going to interpret the data, and you're going to get what they think is important. My personal preference is to get as many listeners as possible to listen in on the discussion, because sometimes we hear what we want to hear. Moving up the chart, another important source of data is administrative data. It's not collected for research purposes, but for an administrative purpose. In other words, an official needs the information. Aside from helping the official to do her job, the data can also be very useful for market participants. A good example might be data collected by a municipality on completion certificates that are issued when a dwelling is ready for occupation. You could use this data together with data on sales from the Land Ministry, another important source of administrative data, to give you a good sense of how long it takes for developers to move their stock, which is a great indicator of effective demand. There is also transactional data, located within a financial institution or a regulator. In South Africa, for example, we analyze deeds data, which is an administrative data set, and credit bureau data, which is a transactional data set, to understand the performance of mortgage loans in South Africa across different segments of the market. This data is mostly accurate. Either the customer made the payment or did not. And from it, you can work out the aggregate repayment patterns in different segments of the market. The challenge is often to get this data. In many cases, transactional data is sitting inside a company. It's not common to get companies to part with their data on a voluntary basis. Even if they do, you might not get a full industry view. In some cases, you can get data out of a centralized system, like a credit bureau, which collects data from many financial services providers. Even then, you often have to pay to access the data, and often there are clear rules governing who can access the data. For instance, in the case of credit bureaus, they might stipulate that only those who contribute to the data may use it. A critical trend is that regulators are starting to get more and more detailed data, in some cases at transaction level. Because sector participants are submitting data, they obviously know what data the regulators have and should be well placed to motivate for more regular publication of more industry data by regulators. Of course, the challenge with this data is that by definition, it monitors formal activity only. So we are missing a huge chunk of the market. This is where other interesting data sets come in, including imagery. It is particularly useful in housing. As we always say, the nicest thing for researchers about houses is that you can see them and you can count them. And it is getting cheaper and more feasible to see them and count them, with processed aerial imagery collected using drones. This can be used for tracking housing construction, formal and informal, understanding building typology, location, building materials, and so on. You can effectively program a system to process and categorize the data for you, so you don't have to have manual inspection of each image. Finally, the Internet of Things generates data through a large variety of interactions and instruments, including things like water meter devices. That data too comes into administrative systems and can be analyzed and processed. In conclusion, with this expanding data universe, we should get better and better at understanding demand conditions. But as noted at the outset, we must bear in mind that demand is not fixed. Researching demand with evidence-based data is as important in helping us understand how to shape demand as it is for responding to demand.